Okay, this is a game between Aronian and Dubov played in the World Blitz Championship. And the theme of this lesson is to realize that there are repeating decisions that you need to make in every game, right? With mobility, with center control, and all of these things. So let's see how that pans out here. All right. E4, it's Aronian with the white pieces and Dubov with the black. All right, E4, C5, knight develops. C3, we're going to go towards the center. Without knowing the opening moves, you can understand them by seeing which squares they control or influence. This pawn is under attack, right? You have to see, can black capture that pawn? Well, you know, the whole theme of the six power moves, are there any checks, right? So you can see, boom, check. Knight's going to be undefended, power move number 3. We check him with power move number 1, and we can win the knight. So that knight's off limits. I mean, that pawn is off limits. And now the knight develops. But guess what? Now there's no check, and that pawn is being threatened. So we defend it. Aronian defends it. We castle. He develops for castling. He's got the bishop on this long diagonal. You want to look at the influence of squares by pieces, right? And everything starts boiling down to controlling squares, tactics on squares, and piece activity on squares. You want to get a force majority somewhere, right? So you can launch a gang attack or a tactic that will succeed. All right, bishop develops. And, you know, knights versus bishops, right? So we want to see, okay, the knight can harass this bishop. But the bishop he can come back, and then we can push the knight away, or the bishop can come here and here. The bishop has mobility. He's not trapped. He doesn't have to trade himself for the knight if he doesn't want to. All right, now the bishop has fewer squares, but he still has some that he can run to. So Dubov doesn't go for the bishop. And now this is a big decision in every game. Like, when do you advance through the center? When do you try to engage pawns? So right now there are no pawn engagements, but now here's our first advance up the center, yeah. And it opens up the bishop. We want to see how every pawn move changes the mobility of your pieces, right? So the pawn move opened this bishop up, and is it a threat? And every time any piece moves, you want to see, is it a real threat of sorts? Well, it's increased this mobility. We can't capture with any, you know, we won't gain anything here. We do have the possibility of pushing all the way, and we'll see if that's a threat. So now we have two attackers with one defender on this e4 pawn, and so white has to respond to that somehow, right? So he could try to defend, but he decides to push forward. Now this is a very interesting thing that I realized a few years ago about pawns and pawn movements. This advance to the center semi-closes the center because there's still movement here. This pawn can move. But here's the interesting thing. If this pawn moves, this pawn is forever weak. You see? And you'll see how this pans out in this game, how this becomes an issue. All right, so the rook develops towards the center. And now white is opening up his idea is to open up this rook. You want to make all of your pieces as active and mobile as possible. So Dubov sees this. This is a mini threat of sorts, right? Because he can push and he can take, and it's temporarily defended once. But it opens up lines for the rook, and that we can get that pawn later. And so Dubov sees this because now if he pushes, he can push the pawn and not open up this A file. Yeah. All right. So now the rook develops up on the E file, which means at least for now, there's no plan on pushing the F pawn. He's looking at, maybe defending this pawn again if he needs to. So let's continue. Okay, queen. Now we unite the rooks. And okay, that's all I see for now. All right. So the bishop slides over. We have x-rays. You want to look at all the x-rays whenever a piece moves, whether or not there are pieces in the way, right? So now the bishop on c4, what did it allow, right? Well, it doesn't really even prevent that pawn push. I don't. Okay, so the bishop comes here, but now it's x-raying f7. Yeah, and you'll see that this ends up being a thorn in Dubov's side much later in the game. All right, and now it's actually increased the influence of this rook by moving it. It was on e2, right? And now this rook will be able to defend this pawn also, and that rook becomes more active. Okay, so now he goes for the bishop, and the bishop runs. He has escape squares, and let's see what happens. All right, so now he remaneuvers the knight towards the center, attacking the bishop. And we have to decide whether we're going to give the bishop up or not, or start trading now. Okay, so this is fascinating to me. All right, so he trades, knight takes, and now the bishop slides back. All right, he doesn't want to give up the bishop. So, you know, your trading decisions, once you see where your mobility is going to be better, where you might have a force majority, then you can start deciding what trades to make that a reality. And let's see how this pans. Okay, so this is an interesting move. If we look at the evaluation, all right, so white, because of his greater center control, this bishop is blocked off. This bishop is active on this file for now. And all right, so this pawn move, it's interesting. It doesn't change the evaluation that much. It's actually worse. But to me, that's exactly right. Now it's gone back up because this pawn now is vulnerable. It's going to be vulnerable forever unless he can move it successfully. All right, so now he's going for the big trade-off. Yeah, and because he sees something here, he can defend the pawn. Where was that knight? Yeah, okay. So he defends the pawn. The evaluation goes up to 0.8. And now he pushes, tries to get the knight out of there. Takes. And this was a big mistake because now we can take the knight. And pawn takes. And he probably should have taken with the bishop. So now the bishop runs. Now see, this bishop is compromised by its pawn. So its mobility is decreased here. And he's attacking something. The white bishop is attacking the pawn. And this is very interesting how Aronian starts to break up these pawns. So he had to decide because this pawn's under attack by this bishop. So he blocks that. But now we start shredding, pawn shredding to get more mobility, to get piece activity, to make pawns weak. Yeah. So you look for opportunities like that in your games. All right, so he takes. Well, what's the threat? If he doesn't take, we take, and this pawn is weak, and we could go after it, probably win it with the rook and bishop. So he takes, queen takes. The computer would prefer probably the bishop taking this pawn, but nonetheless. All right, so this look, big blunder here, right? Blunder. So this is great. This is so instructive. We want to increase the scope of all of your pieces, right? Increase your piece activity. And now you're going to see why that bishop on c4. Suddenly we have little guys harassing big guys. Power move number 5. X-raying this pawn, ganging up on this pawn, forming a battery on that pawn. And so the rook has to run. And look at the evaluation, how suddenly it all shifted because of white's force majority on the queen side. Yeah, the rook is more active. The bishop is doing something. You see, and suddenly he's got the initiative, and if he can convert that, the game is over. So we also have power move number 2, attacking the queen. And bishop blocks. And look, this is a question mark, but he's still plus. There are other ways, but their time is running out on the clock, so you're not going to find the best ways of converting a position, a dominant position. So the queen slides over, defending, attacking the undefended rook. Always look for the threat. And he moves the rook. And this is interesting to me. Okay, so if the bishop takes, look at what increased piece activity can do. You know, you have options. Let's see, can he take the bishop? So he takes the bishop, right? But because we already had the initiative, the jump on the opponent, now you have tactical opportunity. So he takes, check with the queen, right? The pieces aren't coordinated, you know, they aren't networked so they can defend one another. And those are themes in all of the games that you play. Look, everything I've said in this game, everything I've pointed out, are decisions that need to be made in every single chess game you play, with the intent of controlling your opponent, getting the initiative, and then converting that. All right, so now he's got 2 attackers on this bishop. That's game over. Yeah, so bishop blocks and queen takes, and there's no way to defend this without, look, mate in 9. Yeah. So I hope you got something out of this game that you can apply in all of your games, and I'll talk to you later.